theism, generally across all human societies, civilizations, cultures, generally takes on two forms: polytheism and monotheism. Polytheism. A polygon, a polyhedron, poly, another Greek word meaning many. Theism, many divines, many gods, many divine personal beings. As opposed to monotheism, monos, a Greek word meaning one. One divine personal being, one God that personally gets involved in its own creation. And herein lies our first conundrum, our first problem. Does God exist? More specifically, does a divine personal being or beings that get involved with you in your terrestrial existence, does it, he or she or they, does that exist? And if so, how do you know? Back to the second hermeneutic, epistemological. How do you know? How do you know? Think back when you were, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. Did you believe in God? Let's say a theistic God. More specifically, a monotheistic God. One divine personal being that is on call 24/7 to hear your prayers. When you were 5 years old, did you believe that? If so, how? You know how? I'll tell you. 'Cause Mama told you so. Mama told you so. Sorry. Not really. Because that's part of our first conundrum. If you're human, you are bound by the physical. You're bound by physical nature. You are not metaphysical. You may aspire to that. You may want to be beyond the physical reality in which we live, which is understandable, trust me. But you're not. In other words, the conundrum here is God has a problem. God has a problem. If humans are not metaphysical, they are not in the realm of the divine, then humans cannot know God. And God knows this. Consequently, if a monotheistic God wishes to make itself known to physically bound human beings, then it's God's problem. God must take the initiative, which the divine does, again, throughout human history, in every single human civilization. And it is referred to as divine revelation. The divine must take the initiative. The divine must reveal itself to human beings if the divine wishes human beings to know the divine. Divine revelation. In the ancient Greco-Roman world, this divine revelation occurred much the same way as it occurred throughout the contemporary Near Eastern Semitic world. You know how? Second conundrum. It gets better. Did you ever play telephone when you were little? Like, again, back, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8, 9, even 10 years old. I don't know. Telephone. So maybe you're in grade school, elementary school. You're waiting for the bus to arrive, short or long, or the carpool to pick you up, or maybe you're just waiting to get out to ride your bike or walk home, whatever. And sometimes teacher would, at the end of the day, make everyone play telephone to kind of burn the time, right? Telephone. How did that work out? Be honest. Never well. First person in this telephone line gets a message and it repeats it, and by the end, it's at the very best garbled, or at the worst, and more often the case, does not remotely reflect the original message. Call it human error. Willingly, unwillingly, ignorantly, intentionally. Think of our paradigms. Manipulation. Well, God, or the gods, decide, you know what, the best way to reveal ourselves, or myself, to humans is to play telephone. I'm going to use oracles, or sibyls, as they were known in the ancient Greco-Roman world, or prophets, as they were known in the Near Eastern Semitic world, like the oracle at Delphi, which in the 4th century BCE supposedly told the Macedonian Alexander that he would become the world's greatest ruler ever up until that point. Ancient Roman sibyls, the Sibyl of Cumea, or Cumaya, the same idea. The prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, etc. They're all human beings playing telephone. Mama told you so. The divine chooses a human being, and not me, and I'm a human being, but this other human being to tell me about the divine, about God. It sounds like a recipe for potential disaster. All three of the world's premier, as of today, monotheistic religious traditions, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are based on divine revelation. That the divine, God, revealed itself to humans through other humans. Sound potentially problematic? Indeed, as the rest of human history will bear out. Only one of those three divinely revealed monotheistic traditions takes it a step farther. And actually, it's a logical consequence, perhaps necessary, if we remain in this labyrinth, this box of thinking, okay? Think of it this way. Anthropologists debate, you know, how long has Homo sapiens sapiens been battling out on planet Earth? 100,000 years, 150,000 years, 200,000 years, who knows? Let's keep it conservative. Conservative estimates, guesstimates are always the best. So let's say human species has only been around 100,000 years. Okay. For the first 98,000 years, I'm stealing this from my favorite Christopher Hitchens again. For the first 98,000 years, as humans are dying in childbirth and at an early age, usually of tooth decay, the divine, the gods, God is like this. Kind of like a school teacher, you know, observing. And only about 2,000 years ago does God finally say, oh, you know what? This whole oracle, symbol, prophet, divine revelation thing, it's not been going that well. How about this? I have a new idea. I can't believe I didn't think of this earlier, even though I'm God. Of course, I have eternity, so who cares? But instead of trying to speak like telephone to other human beings, hoping that they get the message right to other human beings who are probably going to not exactly trust them in the first place, why don't I simply become human? And I'll speak for myself. Well, only one religion in human history has suggested this actually happened. That religion, you may have guessed it by now, Christianity. And what is referred to not only as divine revelation, but divine revelation in and through the process of divine incarnation. Incarnate. The divine has become human. And according to Christianity, that is in this figure known as the Jewish Jesus of Nazareth, subsequently referred to as Jesus Christ, to which we will be returning, obviously, in future lecture sessions. Okay. That's the third hermeneutic, the metaphysical. Basically what the divine is doing, what God is doing, or the gods are doing. Well, while the divine is doing whatever it's doing, humans are also doing things. Yeah? Humans are doing things. And that is the fourth hermeneutic, namely the historical methodology. Humans doing stuff. History comes from a Greek word really meaning to navigate the waters, to find your way. What is history? Well, it's obviously what's gone before us in the now, in the moment, in the present. But hopefully it's a helpful tool, methodology, hermeneutic, to look at previous maps, navigational logs, ship logs, diaries, to avoid problems, shipwrecks along the way, not to make the same errors that others have made before us. History. That's the real benefit to history. And for our purposes, there are especially two components to this: the temporal and the dialectic. The temporal. Once again, our Greek friends, why have one word for something when you can have two? Temporal, as in time. Well, the Greeks had two different terms and concepts, really, for time. One, the first, we still use today. It's the one with which we remain most familiar. Right? What is the technical term for that round object, usually an analog device, on your wall or perhaps your wrist? Right? The technical term is a chronometer, a meter, a measurer of chronos, time. The time that it painfully takes to get through these lecture sessions, I realize. All right. Chronos, father time, measurable time. The time we all think of, usually. Well, the Greeks had a second concept of time, and if you consider that by the late afternoon hours and several flasks and amphorae of wine, they came up with another concept of time called kairos, K-A-I-R-O-S, kairos, which means, get this, time outside of time, man. Time outside of time. Time out. What does that sound like? Maybe one word in English. Time outside of time. One word in English begins with an E, maybe. Eternity. Eternity. However, for the ancient Greeks, there's a flip side to that. Time outside of time, eternity. The flip side? The moment. The moment. Ever had the moment? Well, I hope before you die, you someday do. Anyway, okay, so chronos, kairos, measurable time, time outside of time, eternity. Again, in this course, it's an historical survey of over 2,000 years, but at the same time, there are a lot of concepts, philosophical, theological, otherwise, that are going to require a bit of brain bending to wrap our heads around some of these ideas. Okay, the second idea, the second issue under this method of history, this hermeneutic, the historical, is that of the dialectic, usually referred inaccurately and precisely as the Hegelian dialectic, named after the modern, anyway, German philosopher Hegel. He did not come up with this concept. It's existed for thousands of years, but for reasons we're not going to go into, it's beyond our purposes. It's also sometimes popularly referred to as the Hegelian dialectic. It's got nothing to do with Hegel. All right. What is the dialectic? Things being juxtaposed. Three things. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Thesis. We have a situation. Taxation without representation. In the early 1770s, in the English colonies, or at least many of them, on the Atlantic seaboard of North America, we have a situation, thesis. Taxation without representation. Why should we have absolutely no say in how we determine our lives? At least no contribution to that. Are we just slaves? Indentured servants? Soylent Green? Okay. What happens next if you're following the story here? Antithesis. We now have a conflict situation. Two sides, colonies and the government that controls them, they go to war. 1776. right? They go to war. Conflict situation now. So we've moved from situation to conflict situation. Third thing, what happens next? Synthesis. A new nation is born. A new reality emerges, develops. The United States of America, and more importantly, its Constitution, on which the United States of America, at least, still is based. The problem is that certain issues at that time, 1776 to 1788, let's just say, as this thing called the U.S. Constitution was being forged, developed, certain lingering issues were not, let's just say, addressed. Meaning that 77 years later, something else would happen in this thing now called the United States of America, namely the Civil War. Back to thesis, antithesis, synthesis. History repeats itself. This is the dialectic. Historians like to argue whether that is really appropriate and accurate a description. If it's not, I would leave you with the opinion of the famous American author Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, who opined that if history does not repeat itself, it very often rhymes. Okay, so that is the fourth hermeneutic, the historical methodology. Yeah, that leaves us with our fifth and final one. If the historical hermeneutic, history is what if humans are doing stuff, history, humans doing stuff, that implies that humans are doing stuff. And that's the fifth hermeneutic, the fifth methodology, the cultural hermeneutic. From a Latin word cultus, from which we get the English word cult and culture. What is a cult? What's a cult? It's a gathering together. It could be of human beings. That's what we usually think, human beings. It could also be the gathering together of things, of stuff. Namely, the stuff that humans have done throughout their human history. Hence, culture. Okay, so the cultural hermeneutic. And again, for our purposes in this course, there are three aspects that we must keep in mind. Number one, text criticism. Text criticism. Focusing in this course specifically on Christianity, not to mention the Catholic Church, text criticism. There are 27 books of the New Testament. The life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, right? 27 books of the New Testament. The oldest extant, physically existing, full version of those 27 books is only from about the year 200. That's 150 years, actually more than 150 years after the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, and about 100 years after the life and times of the last of his first immediate followers, the apostle evangelist John. How do we know that stuff was not added, deleted, edited, forged at an even later date. That is, how do we determine the authenticity of an ancient text? It could be any ancient text, not just the Christian New Testament. We don't know if Socrates actually ever lived. His student, Plato, writes about him, but who knows? So the authenticity of an ancient text, any ancient text. In this case, given the nature that this is purportedly a divinely revealed religion through a divine incarnation, it would seem to be kind of important that the seminal story, the foundational texts, we kind of know if they're real or not, authentic. Okay, so authenticity. Either way, once we've established the authenticity or non-authenticity, then we can move to a more accurate and precise analysis of the content of the text. What does the text actually say? Remember, the New Testament was not written in a modern language. It was not even written in ancient Latin. It was written in ancient Greek. We'll come back to some of those problematic issues when we actually look at a few passages from the New Testament in future lecture sessions. Okay. Under the cultural hermeneutic then, archaeology. Archaeology. This has to do with studying all of that stuff that humans have done throughout their human history that is not exactly written down. So it could be buildings, it could be monuments, it could be artwork, it could be potsherds, it could be kitchen utensils, it could be engravings, even though it's written, but technically among scholars it's a different category. Epigraphy, we call the study of actually ancient inscriptions on stone, marble, clay, etc. Epigraphy, it's called. Numismatics, studying coins. So there's a whole, so everything which is basically not written down on, in the ancient world, papyri, paper, but it's not cotton, it's cellulose based, other plant, papyrus, usually at the time, the 1st century anyway. So in any event, archaeology, all that stuff that's not actually written as we would think today of writing something down on a piece of paper. And the reason it's so important is because it often goes, more often than not, goes hand in hand with text criticism, because archaeology can, and fortunately often will, confirm or not confirm the written record. Text criticism. Okay. Finally, thirdly and finally, art history. I mentioned archaeology, all that stuff humans have done in history, not written down, like art, their own art. So what is art, and what is the study of art, or its own history, art history, right? What is art? For our purposes in this course, 2 things. Representation and representation. Representation of what? Regardless of the medium, right? Whether you're painting oil on wood, or painting a fresco, or sculpting, or making a mosaic. Representation. You are representing, depicting, a person, place, thing, or event that has happened, or perhaps at the time is happening, right? So a representation, a depiction of that. Today, perhaps we would think of it more as kind of that photographic, that Kodak moment, right? I'm dating myself, but that moment on your smartphone, so-called smartphone. Anyway, so a representation of a person, place, thing, or event at the time or in history. And that brings us to the second idea of representation. Representation. What happens if I'm representing something, depicting something that happened 1,000 years earlier? For example, Jesus of Nazareth. Do we actually have a representation, a depiction, a portrait, if you will, of Jesus of Nazareth at the time he was alive? We'll come back to that at a later date as well. Who knows? We know we certainly have depictions, representations of Jesus of Nazareth 1,000 years later, and from our perspective, 1,000 years ago, let's say the year 1000 CE or AD, the medieval period. Maybe it looks kind of like what Jesus probably looked like. Either way, it's definitely going to be influenced. Necessarily, it's going to be influenced by the life and times, the current cultural reality in which the artist has grown up, lives, and represents and depicts. Not to mention if the artist wishes to take artistic license in the rendition, in the depiction, right? That's a representation. Art. The third and final point of this last hermeneutic. Okay, so that basically completes. I realize very dry and very theoretical, but these are actually structural methodologies, hermeneutics, as well as not to mention the paradigms, to give us real structure, not a sense of structure, feeling of structure, but actually tools, instruments to analyze this entire body of material we will be analyzing and studying in future course lectures.